Welcome to Food Access and Sovereignty in the Urban Landscape, the third session in the sole series on the role of horticulture in cultivating social and land equity. This was recorded on Thursday, January 7th, 2021, and was presented by Cheyenne Sundance of Sundance Harvest, and this series is being presented in partnership with Gaia College. We didn't hit record until the second slide of Cheyenne's presentation, so we're going to jump right in.
Come in and see how the farm is run. So because of that, it really made a lot of sense for my farm to be two-pronged, both growing great vegetables and then also growing great new projects. And here in the photo, you can see lovely tomatoes. I grew lots of tomatoes last year. So the darker colored tomatoes are called Mountain Magic. And then I have some really beautiful sun golds and sakura. I have Big Dina in here too. I love growing tomatoes. So Sundance Harvest is two heated greenhouses, about 2,000 square feet for both. This is my greenhouse number one. Greenhouse number two, I just got in December on my lease, and I'm still working that out, adding some good compost in there. And then I have some outdoor field space. So Sundance Harvest is expanding. I might actually have 2 acres by next year, but I don't want to jinx myself. But this is a really good starting point. A lot of people ask me how I got to where I am today. And I would say the biggest tip I could give anyone is to start small. I actually only started with half of this greenhouse. Half of this greenhouse you see today, I had that for about a year. And I was slowly just growing some tomatoes and some peppers and seeing how I was doing as a farm, because growing vegetables is something that I've always really knew how to do, but I never really knew anything about running a business and running an equitable business. So I didn't want to get over my head, and I really wanted to take my time. So that's kind of what I did. And that's why I started with half. And then I think this November, I got another one, and then I got outdoor field space. So this is about what I grow. I really like to grow greens. So I'm transitioning more to a salad farm because I find that's the easiest things to grow. So most of the crops that you'll see in my spring, summer, fall, and winter section, they're primarily things you can add into a salad. So some sorrel with some kale and some cucumbers and some edible flowers. That makes like a beautiful summer salad. And I try not to grow things that are space intensive. So things like corn, I love corn, but it doesn't really do so well in a very intensive farming system in the city. And potatoes, squash, I can't actually grow that because I simply can't yield enough. And because I pay a lease, it gets a bit tricky. And you'll probably see a lot of the crops here aren't necessarily perennials, but as I expand, and I'm located at Downsview Park, by the way, which is like a park in Toronto, in the north part of Toronto. As I expand, I'll be planting perennial fruit bushes, so currants and gooseberries and haskberries, which are a really beautiful berry if you live in a cold climate, colder than here. They can grow amazing if you have a hard time growing blueberries. So I tend to grow lots of annuals because I am on leased land. And that's kind of the kind of thing you want to think about if you're thinking about urban farming or even farming in general, is what is the difference between farming on leased land and owned, quotation mark, land for you, right? Regarding lease, it's a bit difficult to make long-term plans. So planting a whole field of rhubarb and asparagus isn't something I can really do in good faith. Because you never know what will happen the next year, even in Toronto's housing market and in commercial real estate market too. So having annual crops that were yielding like a high amount of income for me was really important. And that's what I always recommend with anyone leasing. Just plant annuals that are easy to grow and easy to harvest. And of course, you can also plant things like squash. You just have to kind of understand that it may not yield as much as someone with 2 acres would if you're doing a smaller space. I also grow mushrooms. That's something that I don't talk about a lot because it's a bit tricky to grow mushrooms. If you ever tried, you'll know that they are a labor of love because they take a lot more sterilization than your average garden carrot. I love carrots too, but mushrooms are very interesting because I want to use the spent substrate, so what they grow in, like rye or straw, as compost, because I really want to try to do a closed loop system. So if you have a farm or a garden, I highly encourage diving into mushrooms. It doesn't have to be wearing lab coats and doing everything indoors. You can actually just inoculate them. So spread the little spawn that you get in a bag outside on your mulch. for example. They love to grow in wood chips. They love to grow in straw. So an easy mushroom to start with is actually wine cap. Wine cap mushrooms are one of the easiest mushrooms to grow outside. And as long as they're relatively moist and not in a sunny environment, you can probably get a good harvest. So I usually do mushrooms outside because I don't have all the high-tech sterilization to do a big bunch of indoor mushrooms. And it works actually pretty good. But that's the main thing people would say, oh, here you grow is mushrooms. But I tend to grow a lot more vegetables, and I would say mushrooms is about probably like 10% of what I grow. And in the photo on the right, we can see Salanova. I grow lots of Salanova as well. And Salanova is a type of lettuce that is multi-cut, so you can cut it a few times. So growing methods. So my growing methods for Sundance Harvest is, I would say, pretty straightforward and simple. I do low till. So low till basically means I try to invert the soil as little as possible. And another word for that is I try to disturb the soil. So I don't believe in tractors. I don't believe in like heavy mechanized tools. The most till I've ever done is broad forking. Is simply when you get a wide fork and you put it into the soil, move it back and forth to aerate. And I only broad fork after I remove a crop. So let's say I have a field of tomatoes and it's November and I want to plant some spinach to overwinter. I would remove the tomatoes. What I usually do if I'm transplanting right after is I actually remove the whole plant and the roots. If I'm not transplanting after, I leave the roots to die in the soil, and then I just broad fork the bed. But besides that, I use organic growing methods. That's actually incredibly important to me. I want to be able to have friends over and eat my cucumbers without washing them. So that's the kind of feeling I want at my farm. I want to have people come for tours, pick a cucumber off the vine and not be like, oh, I have to wash it. So that's really, really important to me for my farm. And the ways I can actually do low-till and organic growing methods without spraying pesticides is beautiful, beneficial insects. They are my life force of my farm. You can see actually in any photo I have ever taken, there's always a ladybug, and there's a ladybug in this photo of Salanova. It might be a bit grainy, but you can see it. And ladybugs eat the aphids. So it's because I have greenhouses and they're heated, there's a lot of aphids that come. And you may know this if you have houseplants and maybe it's a certain time of the year and you're seeing these tiny little red bugs or green bugs or gray bugs on your crops, especially on your leafy greens or even your houseplants. And the thing is with greenhouses, it's really difficult to have a pest-free greenhouse, especially with pests that are the type that like to eat your greens, because it's not a natural environment that you would have outside. A natural ecosystem has both predators and prey, borage and yarrow and goldenrod and all these amazing pollen-rich flowers too for the predators such as ladybugs. But a greenhouse doesn't have that often. So I don't have the natural ecosystem, so I have to really mimic it in the best way possible, which is introducing predators to eat the prey, the aphids. So that's an example. I use so many different beneficial insects actually. It'd probably take a long time to name them all, but ladybugs are the best. And if you aren't growing in a greenhouse, the easiest way to introduce them into your garden outdoors is actually to plant native pollinators. So plant some black-eyed Susans, plant some echinacea, some yarrow, some wild strawberry. Those are just some of the really great ones that I love. But really learning about what are the native plants that are in your area and which ones have the most pollen will really help increase the ladybugs. So protected culture. So here's me super happy. I'm really happy because I'm growing in a protected culture. So what is that? So it doesn't have to be a fancy schmancy greenhouse, as you can see here. It can be simple as a plastic cover over your crops. A good example is in this photo, you see these wires. These wires are over my greens. And it's because in the month of August, there was way too many grasshoppers around. Like the amount of grasshoppers, I was very surprised. And I had my vents open and I wasn't really thinking about it much. And then one day I came in and half of my crop was gone. And I was like, what are these bites I'm seeing on my collard greens? And it was before I took this photo. And it was actually grasshoppers. So grasshoppers ate a lot of my greens. So I've actually had these hoops on because I was transplanting and I needed some shade cloth over it. So these hoops are great because you can use them for shade cloth, you can use them for insect netting to get rid of those grasshoppers, you can use them for plastic polytunnel. So protected culture is really protecting the crop with anything. And I would say having this kind of wire, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy, it could just be old PCV piping, it could be an old hanger, like a wire hanger that you just bend. Recycling those materials is really smart and really great. But if you want to do crops like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants outdoors, they don't really like wet leaves. So you really want to ensure that there's not a lot of dew on their leaves, not a lot of wetness on their leaves. So having something like a protected culture outdoors could simply just be a row of wire many hoops, and you put some plastic on top, and then they're protected from the rain. So that's something that I really like to employ at my farm. Even outside on the field, I actually grow field tomatoes, but I grow them in a caterpillar tunnel. So what that basically is a caterpillar like of hoops and plastic on top. And if you're looking from far away, it kind of looks like a caterpillar. It's really cool. And I'd highly recommend doing that if you want to start a farm or you want to grow a lot more tomatoes, because I can say from growing field tomatoes in the past, I have about 50% more crop. In this greenhouse, as you can see here, the whole greenhouse, I can grow about 100 pounds of tomatoes a week. So compared to outdoors, that would be a lot less. Pest management. So beyond just, aphids and ladybugs, there's a bunch of other types of pests that I deal with. So like I said, grasshoppers is one. The cucumber stripe beetle is another. So the biggest thing I do to not spray is actually to use something called insect netting. It's really simple, really easy to use. If you don't have access to insect netting and you want to find a cheaper alternative, using tulle is actually a really good choice. Tulle is what ballerinas have, I guess, for their tutus. That kind of mesh fabric, you can use that. You can go to the fabric store and get that, and it's fairly cheap per yard, and just use that over a hoop structure. So that's a good alternative. So I basically have every single crop under cover. If you went to Sundance Harvest in like June, you'd be like, where's the vegetables? It's because it's all undercover. So it's not the most aesthetic, but it does mean I don't have to spray anything nasty that I wouldn't want in my friends' bodies or my own bodies, or obviously my customers. And in this photo, you can see I have some tomatoes. My tomatoes did really well under culture. They did have a bit of cracking, but that's simply because I had irregular watering. It was very hot, and then it was not very hot, but that's probably fine. So how I run my farm. So here I am, and this was December. This was the second week of December, I think. I was picking spinach, actually, out in the snow, and it survived. This spinach type is called Olympia. If you want really good spinach for the winter, Olympia is the best. This is from William Dam Seeds. So I usually sell direct as much as I can. For me, starting off as a new farmer, I really wanted to ensure that I didn't have to find work off of my farm. And because my lease is thousands and thousands of dollars a month, I needed to have a profitable farm. And that was as simple as it is, actually. So I have a weekly subscription CSA, and having a weekly subscription CSA was the better option for me. I was really worried that if people paid me like $20,000 up front, I would actually have to deliver. And a lot of my friends told me horror stories about them having a CSA, and mid-season they're like burnt out. And they're like, oh, I can't stop because people paid. And I really wanted that option because as someone with a disability, it was really important for me to pace myself and not burn out, because I didn't want to stop farming because I had a bad experience with it. So figuring how to make a CSA work for me was really beneficial. So I always recommend that to anyone. You can make a CSA into what you want, and most likely your customers are going to be probably happy with it as long as you're growing great vegetables. I also have an online farm store. Because of COVID, I really had to pivot. Everyone uses that word. I had to pivot though, to figure out how to sell my vegetables, because I did sell about 50% of my vegetables at the farmer's market, a local farmer's market called Dufferin Grove Farmer's Market. My favorite farmer's market in the city. They're so cool. But because they switched to online and things were a bit wonky for a bit for me, figuring out where I sell my vegetables, I just tried an online farm store, and that worked out really, really great. I have 50 plus orders a week. Right now I'm taking a bit of a break, but because I had an online farm store, that also meant I could showcase products that otherwise weren't my own. So I sell a lot of great products by primarily Black and Indigenous artisans, growers, and fisher people. So for example, I sell a really amazing maple syrup from this amazing couple that live in St. Joseph's Island, like 6 hours north of Toronto. It's amazing maple syrup, super highly recommended to anyone to check it out. I'll link the name later in the chat. It's called Giazat. And then I also sell fish from a company called First Fish, where they pay Inuit fisher people to fish, and then they sell it to the public. So I buy that wholesale as well. And then a few other products I also sell. And I also try to connect with like local Indigenous makers here in Toronto. I sell cedar tea and a bunch of other things too. So I found that to be a really good avenue for me. So as a year-round farm, I would say there's a few reflections I have, and I'm going to get into the next section quite soon. But community engagement has just been something really easy for Sundance Harvest. As you see on my Instagram, people are very engaged, but also because I'm in such a city center, it's very visible to the public. So if someone wanted to visit Sundance Harvest to get inspiration or just hang out with me, they could easily come and they could easily find transit to come to my farm. There's a subway station actually like 10 minutes away and the park by walking. So if you're thinking about starting a farm or you're thinking about doing a community project, having the community engagement piece is really important. So thinking how accessible is the space and how can we make it more accessible? BIPOC Youth Incubator Farm. So I'm going to talk a bit about growing in the margins and why it's a really good example of food justice and community engagement. But that's one of the key pieces of Sundance Harvest that I'm noticing is doing really well. And accessibility and visibility. I'm the only year-round farm in Toronto, which makes it a very interesting time at the farmers market with no competition. But that being said, I do think that year-round farming is the future. I think that we can produce local food really great here in Ontario undercover and even across Canada. So I try as much as I can to talk about protected culture and why it's super great to grow under it. I think I can grow spinach without heating my greenhouse. So that's a really good example. Spinach can do extraordinarily well with just a row cover and a polytunnel. And here you see my oyster mushrooms in the photo on the right. Oyster mushrooms are one of the easiest mushrooms to grow. Highly recommend growing my oyster mushrooms if you're starting mushroom growing. So a bit more reflection. So these are the roadblocks I face. So the roadblocks I face with land access, pretty obvious if you live in the city. There's not a lot of space, and the way I got my greenhouse was very unconventional. I saw that it was empty because I peeked inside of it one day with my friends. I was like, what is this place? And I peeked inside the greenhouse, and they had a golf cart in it. A golf cart was just charging in the greenhouse in the middle of summer. So I said, why is there a golf cart in it? Can I lease this greenhouse? And they said, yes. And then from just simply asking and being curious, I ended up getting now 2 greenhouses and hopefully will expand to the entire area, hopefully by 2022. So I would say like the biggest roadblock was land access, because before then, of course, I was trying to find a land big enough to farm in the amount I wanted in the city, but I couldn't find it. So sometimes it's simply just about asking, and having long-term stability is hard. Right now, I'm in the process of trying to renew my lease to have it be multi-year. So I want to have a multi-year lease to have more stability, to be able to grow perennials and beautiful strawberries and all of those great crops. Building infrastructure. I can't actually build really anything new on the land I lease. So that's another roadblock for you if you have leasing over owning land, because building infrastructure is really important. You need a wash and pack shed. What if you want to build a cooler? What if you want to have like a nice gazebo for events? You can't really do this on leased land unless you have explicit permission. And I don't have that, so I can't really build this infrastructure. The most I can have is a caterpillar tunnel, and even then is pushing it. Crop limitations. I would love to have a primarily perennial farm. I love perennials, and I like the idea that I'm doing the least tilling as possible, and having a crop stay in its place for years and years to come is my dream. But I can't really do it in my incidents because I have a year-to-year lease. But that's something that I would love to have one day and plant a lot more fruit trees. So utilizing social media. So this actually has been a really plus for me. I'm not one that really likes social media. I feel like I need a lot of time in nature, but this is the only time I'm on my phone is to go on Instagram. And what I've tried to do is, I know there's a lack of representation in agriculture, especially for lack of representation for a farmer with a disability. So I usually make weekly videos to talk about my experiences farming with a disability, my experiences farming as a BIPOC farmer. And I find that really helps a lot. And I get a lot of messages from people like in Ohio or like Tanzania, and they're like, I saw your Instagram. And I'm like, oh, that's nice. So I would say this has been a plus for me. If we're talking about a rose and a thorn, this has been a big rose for me. So why did Sundance Harvest start? So now we're going to get more into the food justice and actionable items and all that great stuff. So here I am in a sea of kale having a great time. So Sundance Harvest started because simply I could not find one farm to work at or even to have a tour at that was focused on equity in agriculture and had representation. I didn't know one farmer of color simply because I didn't know they existed. We didn't have a lot of representation at large organic conferences for farming or unions for farming. And I really wanted to change that. So instead of kind of just waiting and waiting for one to sprout up, I just wanted to start a farm. So Sundance Harvest is a BIPOC-centered farm. And what that means is I primarily focus my programming, education, and also I really try to give resources to other farmers who are Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. So I started because I saw a lack in the food system and a lack of representation of people that look like me. A lot of the positions of urban ag in Toronto are within no non-for-profits, and that's super great that they're doing work, but oftentimes entry-level positions are for BIPOC teens in the area, and there's no upward mobility for them. So then maybe they're just at a minimum wage position for the summer, and then they get let go. And that it causes a lot of issues because they don't get business planning and they don't get the experience of growing food for a full season. So there's a lack of education as well. And I'm going to get into that in a bit. So how did I start? So I actually started with only a $5,000 grant from the Care Cache. I don't actually apply for grants regularly. I once a year apply for the Care Cache, just $5,000 for infrastructure and building. Like for example, the $5,000 made me this bed. You can see here in the greenhouse. Literally, I just bought the wood and the soil because it was so expensive. But besides that, just good business planning helped me. I don't work off of my farm. Like I work solely at Sundance Harvest. I don't have any other employment. Never had for a year and a half. But it started simply because I asked questions. I would say when Sundance Harvest started, it was not as popular as it is today. It was very unpopular because I asked a lot of questions and I made a lot of people uncomfortable. And I said, why do things have to exist like this? We can do it another way. And from what I've been told, there has not been any education program that is devoted to starting up new farms for BIPOC youth in Toronto. So when I started Sundance Harvest, it was a bit hard at the beginning because I was pushing back against this narrative that was like, you don't have space here. But then after a few months, I got lots of support. And you'll probably see this. If you're feeling a void within your community, something that should exist but doesn't, it may take a bit for people to get on board, but when they do, they'll be so happy and you'll have such a strong community. So that's kind of how I started, really with not a lot. I don't have any formal background regarding agriculture. I know a lot of people are going to ask me this. I never really went to high school. I skipped a lot of my classes and I didn't do well in biology. So I have nothing really going for me regarding agriculture, but I made it work because I read a lot of books. Sometimes I would visit my friends' farms. I would ask questions, but I never had a formal farm job. I did work in Cuba a bit, but it was basically eating mangoes on my friend's farm in Vinales, Cuba, but nothing really intense. So I would say reading books and watching videos is my primarily source of knowledge. So I want to talk about examples of equitable agriculture. So besides Sundance Harvest and how I run, there's some other organizations I'd like to talk about. So BK Rot. So BK Rot is an organization that is located in Brooklyn, New York, and I really like them for a few reasons. One, they're a social enterprise. So they hire youth directly in Brooklyn, so largely BIPOC youth who otherwise wouldn't have employment. And they're youth that are in high school, youth that need that community hours maybe. And what they do is they take compost, or they take soon-to-be compost from neighboring restaurants and houses that participate, and they turn that into rich, nutrient-dense compost in the heart of Brooklyn. And it's so beautiful to see, and I actually visited their operations, I think about a year ago, and I was stunned with how beautiful it was, because these youth are actually given their own autonomy. They're told, you are the manager of this site. And they're like, okay, great. And then they make the site duties. They decide how the site will be run. And I think really giving youth that autonomy is such a beautiful thing. And of course, it's a social enterprise. So the youth are paid fairly and they sell the compost as well. And this gives the youth really good business management skills. And we often don't see this with entry-level jobs in agriculture, especially in Toronto. There's not a lot of business talk about how to run a farm. Sure, you can learn how to grow a carrot, but if you can't sell that carrot, kind of what are you going to do, right? So BK Rot infuses education, but also pays their youth, which is the really important piece of getting youth involved in agriculture. And a second, more local example would be Food Share. So Food Share, I'm guessing most of us know Food Share. They're a nonprofit here in Toronto that focuses on food justice. So besides providing amazing free good food boxes to families that are in need and are hungry, they go a step further than that. They provide food justice. So they call out systemic racism and colonialism in the food system, and they try to address it with social programming. So a really good example is this photo here is actually in the neighborhood I grew up in Etobicoke. I didn't know this farm existed until 3 years ago, and it's so beautiful. It's about a 2-acre farm. My friend Adam and Echo, and I actually taught Echo in my program, Growing in the Margins, which I'll talk about soon. Both of my friends run this 2-acre farm. And what this farm does is they grow nutrient-dense organic food, and they give it to people within good food boxes for free. And they also sell it directly to the local community. And they farm on the property of the TDSB, so a local school district here in Toronto. So this is a really good example. This was otherwise a football field, and now it grows so much food for the local community. My mom loves their farmers market. She walks on over and gets some tomatoes and has a great time. So Food Share is a really great example because what they're doing is they're animating a space in a community that I grew up in that otherwise doesn't really have a lot of food options. We have a Loblaws and a No Frills, but they're quite far apart from each other. And I remember as a kid, if I knew this existed, I would be like, wow, I can see agriculture happening directly in my community. Maybe I would have been a farmer sooner. So this is a really good example as well. So I want to talk a bit about food security, food justice, and food sovereignty, and kind of what do they mean. So food security. So food security is simply having food. It could be, it could be Kraft Dinner, it could be Wonder Bread, it could be some food that isn't actually nutrient dense or maybe not culturally relevant either. So simply having food. And I know about food security a lot because I grew up food insecure, and I know the feeling of not having food that is nourishing. So food justice is understanding that there is a reason why people are food insecure. And it's not simply because they don't have a motivation or ambition, it's because the lack of housing here in Toronto, the price of housing and rents, the lack of appropriate wages. Minimum wage in Toronto is so low compared to the cost of housing. It's also other reasons that are more systemic, like structural racism. It's also redlining. What neighborhoods can people live in? What neighborhoods were acceptable to live in tens and tens of years ago? It's also colonialism. If someone's traditional hunting lands are paved over and a pipeline's built on it, how are they going to access that food? So food justice is really the theory and the thought about why people are actually not having food in the first place. Is there a grocery store, but is it 10 kilometers away from someone's community? Do they have to walk? Do they have to own a car? Is that why they're not getting the food that they need? So it's really thinking about that piece. And the 2 examples I showed you were food justice. BK Rott, for example, saw that local Black youth in Brooklyn weren't getting the either the education that they needed or the pay that they wanted for the work that they wanted to do. So they made BK Rott. So these youth could actually be paid fairly, learn about composting, and then start their own enterprises. Food Share saw the same thing and said, well, it's not enough we're just giving people, pasta and rice-a-roni and our good food boxes. We should actually give them nutrient-dense food and food that's culturally relevant. So at their site I just showed you in the photo at BCI and Etobicoke, they grow okra, they grow callaloo, they grow culturally relevant food for people to eat, so they don't feel so they have to like assimilate to the Western diet if that's not what they grew up in. So food sovereignty is the ultimate goal. So food sovereignty is the people that are most oppressed have the most power in the food system, to put it as bluntly as possible. The best example I can give you is La Viva Campesina. La Viva Campesina is the international peasant farmers movement, sorry. And what they do is they catalyze change by creating a dialogue about what food sovereignty means and why it's important that seed sovereignty is included, that seed isn't patented by large corporations like Bayer, Monsanto, and also why small farms are the future. So food sovereignty is community control over the food system. So deciding where we grow food, how we grow food, not having football field and tennis courts in communities that are food insecure that otherwise don't actually need them as a football field, like Food Share, what they did there. So I would say in terms of levels, food sovereignty is like the goal. The community that's most affected having the most control. And I'm going to be dropping in some links here in the chat box if you want to learn more. I have a learning resources page that talks all about that and gives you really great examples. And of course, food sovereignty includes land back. So that has to be Indigenous people having their traditional land back, because really how is one supposed to have food sovereignty if they cannot access their traditional foods? And that's also what food sovereignty is about. So here's an example of food justice and also an example of equitable agriculture and equitable urban agriculture. Our program, Growing in the Margins. If I could say I was proud of anything I've ever done in my life, this is the thing I'm proud about. Growing in the Margins is a free urban agriculture program for youth who are marginalized in the food system. This was my thing I've always wanted to have. I've always wanted to be in a program like this, and I could never find it. So I just created it. And here I am. This was a while ago. This is early 2019, I think, or something like that. Here I am with a couple of the people in the first cohort of Growing the Margins. I'm missing about 10 people here, but the person standing up is Echo, and Echo manages this site on the right. You can see here, Food Shares BCI Farm. They now manage that because they have the education now. And then my friend X, and then Adjoa. And Adjoa actually works at a rooftop farm here in Toronto, and they do some really great work growing amazing food and pollinator plants. So Growing the Margins is a 12-week mentorship program. So what that means is 4 times a year, I have cohorts of 20 students broken up into 2 classes. And what they do is they learn with me, they go on field trips to BCI, Food Shares, Urban Farm, as you can see here. They go to Black Creek Community Farm. They go to a bunch of different places. And we talk about food, the food system, and how they want to be involved in it. And the way intake happens is I post that intake is open. For example, the spring intake is open right now, and I say, hey, if you're interested in Growing the Margins, apply. They write a cover letter, and they have to say why they're interested. Because I get 80 plus applications on average per season, and I can only admit 20 youth, I need to kind of know why they're interested in it. It's not really so much for gardening, it's primarily for starting their own farm or food sovereignty project. So they also learn things about business planning as well. So I teach them how to run a profitable business. If they want to do that, I also teach them how to communicate and how to have effective communication with organizations and people that want to start a food sovereignty project. But they learn strictly everything you can actually think about. They learn how to create compost. They learn how to start beds, greenhouse management, pest management, starting seedlings, all of that great stuff. So they're set and ready to go to start any of their projects they would like. And actually, I have some cool updates about some of the current participants from the fall cohort. So the people that graduated the fall cohort that just passed, they're starting some projects. For example, Aaliyah on my right, who's holding that basket, which has Scotch bonnet actually, Aaliyah's starting their own farm in Guelph this spring. It's a beautiful farm they're starting, and they're renting land from an organic farm in Guelph, and they're going to be growing a diverse array of vegetables, and I'm super proud of them. Temple, who's holding the Swiss chard, they want to start a community farm project that focuses on food sovereignty for Black and Indigenous youth, and I'm really excited about that too. Hermela, who is looking really happy behind that mask, looking really happy. They are starting a microgreen farm, and I'm actually directly buying microgreens from them, and I'm selling that on my online farm store to help them start their business. And then Fatia, on the far left of me, they're holding beautiful Swiss chard, and they want to actually become a coordinator within Growing in the Margins. So I would love to hire them one day, and that's why Growing in the Margins is actually becoming a non-for-profit legally, so I can get some grants and hire them and hire the rest of the alumni of Growing in the Margins. So that's what Growing in the Margins is. It really catalyzes new projects. I would say from the 16 youth, because we had a smaller COVID student body this year, but from the 16 youth, 6 of them are starting farms next year. 6 of them are starting farms next year in the Kitchener, Waterloo, and Guelph region, and the rest of them are either starting their community projects or they're still, thinking and mulling it over. So it's actually a very cool program because a lot of the youth now have the skills that they need. And with the program, I really want to make it clear to them that I wasn't actually doing an unpaid internship. So when they're part of Growing the Margins, they actually never do anything on my farm. Sure, they look at my plants and they ask me questions, but they'll never weed, they'll never harvest, unless it's directly related to their learning, because I want to actually have that separation. I have employees that I pay above minimum wage, and they're not my employees. So I want to ensure that they're only focused on their education. So my role, I think, in food justice is I focus on education for justice and sovereignty. I noticed that most of my friends and a lot of the people I came into contact with when I started Sundance Harvest said, wow, it's so great that you started this. I wish I knew how to do it. So I said, well, why don't I just teach them? And that's why I started growing the margins, because simply it wasn't fair that I noticed that all these BIPOC youth are so interested in agriculture, but there's not a space for them to learn at. And there's not representative education. If someone, for example, if a Black youth is coming to growing the margins, they might have a fraught relationship with the land, right? Intergenerational trauma can carry over with the land. And as someone who has experience with that, with intergenerational trauma with the land, I want to be there for them when they're having lived experiences that might be painful on the land. Transatlantic slave trade, colonialism that's ongoing, those things affect BIPOC youth, and they affect Black and Indigenous youth when we're working with the land. So I really want to ensure that the teachers that they were learning from reflected themselves. And I found that really beautiful. And a lot of the times, a lot of us cried and a lot of us talked and we shared experiences that were really deep. And I'm very proud of all of my alumni and everything that they're doing. So education was the key piece for me. I don't have the means to sell my vegetables for less than what I already do, but I do have the means to provide free education, which is what I do. And I make it free by usually getting into I get donations from like restaurants, for example. Aloe, a restaurant here in Toronto, donated money to me to run this program for 4 seasons. So I'm doing it like that, but I usually don't get federal grants or anything like that. It's usually just private donations. So unpaid internships versus growing the margins for new farmers. So on the intake form for growing the margins, there's like a comment section, which I ask, hey, like, why are you applying? And I would say about at least 40% of the youth say, I don't want to do an unpaid internship. So it's kind of like a joke amongst growing the margins folks that this is the alternative to an unpaid internship, simply because one, it's not accessible for a lot of the youth. Not being paid for 6 months to 7 months is also a privilege. If someone can rely on their family income or their existing income and they don't have dependents or family member to take care of or kids, that makes it a lot easier for them to get the farm education. And I think it should be a level playing field. And I think that education should be provided no matter what your financial background is or your means to get that finances. So a lot of the youth have preferred growing the margins because they can still access their family members, they can still take care of their kids, and also because they weren't doing unpaid labor. Like they're not weeding to just learn maybe how to grow carrots for 1 hour. They're strictly learning the education and that's all. So I found that was really beneficial for a lot of the youth and they felt very valued and dignified in the work. And of course, it would be remiss to not talk about why it's very painful for Black youth to do unpaid internships on farms that don't reflect themselves. So that's a key piece as well for many of the Black youth that are part of growing the margins. But I would say that this is a really good alternative, having a direct education that is solely based on education. So many people ask me why I focus on BIPOC youth for growing the margins. And there's a lot of studies, for example, this really great study from University of Toronto Proof Department from 2016 talks about how Black and Indigenous households face the most food insecurity. What I truly think my role as a farmer is to provide that education. So sure, I can't provide low-cost food, but I can provide education. So I usually understand and I read stats, and I also talk about my lived experiences and other people's lived experiences with not being reflected. So that's usually why I focus on Black and Indigenous youth and BIPOC youth as a whole. And of course, growing in the margins also focuses on youth with disabilities. I have a disability myself. I have a vestibular disability, which affects my speech and my hearing. So I really encourage youth with disabilities to come into growing the margins because you can farm the way you want to farm. There's not a blueprint for farming, and you can make that blueprint yourself. So the key pieces of growing the margins that I think make it equitable and something that maybe you can reflect in your own projects if you'd like to start one are the following. Multi-location. So I have lots of field trips. I would say out of the 12 classes, we have about four or five that are field trips. So that way youth can see farms all across the city and actually get to know different people in the industry. And that helps them a lot because they end up applying for jobs at those places and they already have a connection. Prioritizing an education model for sovereignty. The cool thing about growing the margins is I don't teach something that's directly business oriented. Sure, they have one class about business, but they also have totally other classes about a bunch of other stuff. They can create their own community garden with with that education. They can create food sovereignty work up north. They can do all these different projects. And a lot of the youth who are involved actually go on and do community-led projects, not really for-profit projects. But having that base of education is a key thing because once you have education, you have independence. so they can really do whatever they want. And having that independence is such a beautiful thing. I partner and support Black and Indigenous people. So through Growing the Margins, the youth actually do a lot of cool things with Sundance Harvest. Sundance Harvest actively gives land back to local Indigenous nations here in Toronto. For example, my very first Growing the Margin plot, which I'm going to go back because I want to show you, this plot right here is at the back of St. Matthias Anglican Church here in Toronto. And I gave that plot of land back to Aboriginal Legal Services, which are a really great organization, Indigenous led, that do consultations, and they do community work with Indigenous families, and they do counseling as well. Then they need an outdoor space to grow food and to have as a community place to gather. So I said, why don't you have this plot? I don't hold land that isn't right to hold for a longer period of time than it is. I knew this land needed to be taken care of, so I grew food, I tended to the soil. But then I also know that I'm not Indigenous to Ontario, so who am I to say to keep this land in my my usage? So I do that as much as I can with any plot I can do. And I would say per year I do that once, because obviously I don't have a bunch of land to give away. But besides that, Sundance Harvest actually grows about 5,000 tobacco seedlings each year, and I give that for free in solidarity to local Indigenous families, organizations, and communities. I also grow a lot of other crops as well, like sweetgrass, and I grow cedar, and I give that away too. So Growing the Margins youth get to see what that looks like to have a real relationship with nations, and what that looks like to have a relationship with organizations that ultimately are striving for solidarity and sovereignty as well. So this is something that I like to show. The goal is to close the loop. So with Growing the Margins, it fits into my close the loop system. So the first one, I would say, this is probably more oriented to when I first got started, but community allies like that church I talked about, St. Matthias Anglican Church, they provided land for me to grow food and to start my very first Growing the Margins behind their church. And they're a really progressive church, by the way. Really cool. I'm big fans of them. An urban farm is created. So I started a little garden, not really little, but a good sized garden, and it feeds people. It feeded the community, it feeded the youth who were involved. They got free vegetables, they got to feed their family. The produce is sold and creates jobs. So this isn't really the case for Growing the Margins because we don't really sell the vegetables. Sundance Harvest is a totally separate farm. But in a different case, the produce could be sold and create jobs. And with that jobs, the new farm workers gain education at the job. So you can do a model that is you hire someone at your farm and they get the education, or you can do Growing the Margins, which is strictly education. But at the end, hopefully, new farm workers or past students like Growing the Margins, they start their own urban farm, and then the loop continues. So really, education, you'll see, is a key piece in here. And I truly think that education is the future of sovereignty, because they can do anything they want with it. And that's the beautiful thing. So here's some actionable items. So I would say when you're thinking about food justice and food sovereignty, it feels like a big thing. The easiest thing I could say is get involved, in the sense of you can start a community garden, you can start an allotment garden, which are both great examples. But we have to remember that food insecurity is not caused by lack of food, it's by lack of resources, whether that be income to buy the food, or resources to grow the food. Big supermarket chains throw out dumpsters of food every day. So there is enough food to feed people, but a lot of people don't have the resources to access that food. So the easiest thing I could say is advocate for land to be used as agriculture as much as possible, and advocate in an urban setting as well. Here in Toronto, there's been countless work that I've been a part of regarding getting golf courses to be turned into urban farms. And I say that with smile and with a bit bittersweet, because sometimes it doesn't work, but oftentimes it gets a lot of press. So I would say advocate as much as possible for community gardens or urban farms, which is a better bet because it's more land, to get started in your community. Another thing I would say is get involved. So get involved in local agriculture scene. The more people involved, the better. So if you live in a rural context in Canada, get involved with the National Farmers Union, NFU. I'm involved with them. I run the BIPOC working group, hopefully soon a caucus. If you're in Ontario, the EFAO is really good too, Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. But basically getting involved in building that community up is really important. But the key thing I would say for like actionable items is push for community gardens and push for allotment gardens and new urban farms to get started. Because the more space that's zoned for agriculture, the better. And I know this is someone who's always pushing for more space to be used. And then the other piece I would say is really read the learning resources I dropped in the chat. If you would like to learn more about food justice and sovereignty and really what you can do, I would say reading the learning resources is really good. I hand-picked every article and every study, and I read it all through, and I have it there so you can learn and take that knowledge and make some really great projects out of it and stuff like that. So that's it. I'm really hoping that this catalyzed you and you have some really great ideas. I'd love to answer your questions. If I didn't say anything in the slide that you wanted, like if I forgot something, totally add that in. Yeah, I'd love to answer.
Thank you. I think everybody wants to go start growing vegetables right now. The weather's not exactly going to cooperate for a little while yet, but let's see what people have put in the chat. And yeah, if people want to actually unmute and ask questions, absolutely you're welcome to do that. I did see a couple of questions pop up in the chat though. Let me just scroll through here. So somebody asked about, are private donations for growing in the margins long-term and sustaining? Just wondering how much time and effort you need to put into fundraising. Your education projects sound fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would say this is a really good question. So they're not ultimately sustaining. I'm lucky that Sundance Harvest gets a lot of like press. So I actually don't solicit donations. Whatever comes in monthly is enough. And by the end of each year, I make it visible what was donated to me because that's the right thing to do. And I have a report. So it hasn't been the end of this year technically yet for growing the margins. And when I do so, everyone's anonymous. So I would say like when I'm looking at the report now and I'm getting it ready to release it, it is sustaining this year because of everything that's been happening with Black Lives Matter movement. People really donated a lot, but I can say that it won't be sustaining long term, and I don't want to have to fundraise for it or anything like that. So that's why I'm actually becoming a non-for-profit for growing the margins. So growing the margins will become a non-for-profit probably in the next few months, getting the paperwork all done and ready. And from that point, it will be probably reliant mainly on grants, but it doesn't actually need that much money to keep going. Growing the margins isn't that intensive for me to run, and whatever donations are usually end up for the tools that we need. We primarily focus on manual hand tools. We get seeds, we get seedlings, and things like that. And there is a small stipend for my labor, but there's actually not a stipend for my labor behind the scenes. So, intake forms and emails and emailing the youth back and forth every day about things that they want to learn. So there's a small stipend, but usually doesn't cover fully everything. So I will become a non-for-profit, and hopefully that'll be better allocated my time, and I can hire some youth who are directly an alumni. That'd be such a cool thing to do.
Oh, that would be really great. There's another question in the chat, but I actually have one that relates to what you just talked, a couple that actually relate to that myself. So I'm going to go ahead and ask my questions. For the growing in the margins, just curious, how many, like, what's the structure? Do they, is it like once a week? Is it several times a week? How many hours? Just out of curiosity to get a sense of what, when you're not putting their time into weeding, how many hours a week does it take sort of over the season to have to actually cover the learning material that you include?
So what it is I break up, because of COVID, I break it up classes into at most 10 people per class. And I usually have a class on the weekend and a class on the weekdays during the day. Both classes are from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., so for 2 hours. So the classes itself, I teach for 4 hours a week, but youth only come to 2-hour classes. They're welcome to email me anytime with questions or concerns. Usually I don't get a lot of emails because they're pretty self-explanatory, my classes. Behind the scenes for intake, I have to look at a lot of applications because it's a very popular program. So I would say each season intake probably takes me about 10 hours because I really want to be thorough and I want to make sure that I'm not missing anyone. And the people that I can't actually admit because of the capacity, I always try to link up with FoodShare or anyone else so they can at least, get that experience in, and I encourage them to apply for next season. Really, it's like a very thin margin, literally, to get into growing the margins. And I would say at most weekly, I spend like 6 hours on growing the margins at most. Because I actually don't script my classes. I just have something to teach about, like preparing beds. and I just teach it. Like I don't actually plan anything I teach.
Yep. When you know it so well, because it's what you do all the time, you just have to explain, this is the thing I do. Yeah. No, that's great.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a question in the chat about when you're growing in the city, how much effort do you need to put into checking for or mitigating soil contamination? Is it an issue for any of your projects?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So here in Toronto, Public Health TO actually released a brochure, I think a few years back, about what is safe soil to plant in and what is not safe soil. So this brochure, I'll probably drop it into the chat.
That would be
And
great.
it's really helpful because it talks about sites that aren't really safe. So sites that were gas stations or railroad sites. And it basically says what to do in those scenarios. So more often than not, is to start raised beds. And if you're in a city that doesn't have something like that, then what I'd recommend to do is to call your local public health line and say, hey, I'd like to grow food. What can I do? Do you have an archive of what used to be here? But if you're worried, it's better safe than sorry to just grow in raised beds. So growing raised beds is super easy. Untreated plywood or recycled materials that are food grade, food safe is an easy thing to do. You can lay down some cardboard and then grow in at least about a foot of soil. And doing that really helps mitigate a lot of the risks. And I think that's a super easy thing to do. I will try to find the public health brochure as soon as I can, though.
Thank you. Yeah, because Ottawa, I'm in Ottawa, and the agreement that a local a group called Just Food, which actually is about food justice, but it's a lot about growing, managed to convince the city to allow gardens in the parks, even with soil contamination. But they did it through coming up with an agreement for raised bed design and structure to ensure that the city wouldn't be liable for soil contamination in the beds. There's another question from Christine. You mentioned your greenhouses at Keel and Shepherd, or Keeley. You can tell I'm in Toronto, I'm in Ottawa, not Toronto. Keel and Shepherd, and what has been the reaction from the local neighborhood to your urban farm?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's an existing corporate urban farm there called Fresh City, but they're not really farming and selling the vegetables so much. It's like kind of hard to explain. So for me, when I started, it's funny. There's 3 greenhouses at the site and 2 acres of land, and Fresh City is moving to a different part of the park at the end of 2021, I guess this year. Wow, 2021. So I'm hopefully taking over the whole site. That's what I wanted. And when I started my greenhouse, the people that I leased from, they're like, oh, can we have a tour? And they didn't think I was actually growing any vegetables in there because for 10 years, really, there hasn't been as much vegetable production as I thought. So most people are very surprised when they see my greenhouse because you saw the first photo. It's filled to the brim with veggies. And there's been a really good local response. A lot of the local youth in the area, I'm noticing, are becoming more involved with Sundance Harvest and messaging on Instagram, asking to come by. And with the warmer weather coming, I'll be having outdoor tours, and I try to keep my tours as small as possible to 10 people. So I usually have a tour once a month from April to October, and I have 5 tour times in a day. So 50 people can come. So that's one of the ways I try to keep safe. But there's been a good amount of interest with any urban agriculture project. You're going to get a lot of interest because it's so visible to the eye. And that's actually a really great thing because if you're a business, you can have a farm stand and you can just directly sell the produce to people that walk by.
Oh, that's great. So there's another question in the chat from Annie. As a self-taught farmer, where/how did you begin teaching yourself?
Yeah, so I would say as a self-taught farmer, where I began teaching myself, the biggest thing I would say would be reading books. I read a lot of books. For example, Elliot Coleman's Organic Grower. It's a great book. It's a timeless book. The Market Gardener by J.M. Frontier. There's a lot of books I read, really anything related to no-till agriculture and small-scale agriculture. And then I watch a lot of YouTube videos that may be unconventional to learn, but it helps me so much. And a lot of the knowledge I actually get is from university extension. So you may know this, but in the States, university extensions are a really big thing for agriculture. For example, Cornell Small Farms Extension, Oregon State Farm Extension, they have a lot of great knowledge related to the production and scale of agriculture. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat about some of them, but that's basically where I learned.
Yes, it's amazing how much information is available for free. As somebody who just stopped actually teaching in a horticulture program, I was sort of at the point of going, okay, well, I've upgraded stuff as well as I can, but honestly, I was left feeling like pretty much everything they teach in that program, it wasn't terribly up to date, and you could get better information off the internet for free. So it's definitely, there's a lot of really good stuff online, and yes, you've compiled it all into one page for people to find. So that's excellent. I'm not seeing other questions right now, so I'm going to go back to asking one of mine.
Mhm.
You mentioned that you're shifting growing in the margins over to a not-for-profit setup, and with the hopes of hiring some of your alumni to help continue to run it. Um, are you considering trying to branch out so there can be more sort of I'm asking this because again, I'm several hour drive away, and I know some people who are working on some stuff here locally in Ottawa that could benefit from having some sort of connection or support with somebody who has been successful and has sort of learned this. And so, is there going to be any distance or online thing in the future of it, where it's sort of alumni support or something where people could participate, but from other places while they're getting up and going?
Yeah, it's actually what I was thinking of doing. Right now with the funding and my capacity with like COVID and all that stuff, I can't really do online as much, but I'm hoping once it's becoming a non-for-profit, I can actually have someone designated to online support and technical support and education. I'd love to have something that is like like a learning resource that someone can do at their own pace. So kind of like a course that's
Mm-hmm.
free. You can sign up for it and you can come and teach yourself whenever you want, that has pre-recorded classes. So what I'd like to do is actually for this season, record my growing in the margins classes and have them as an online resource for people in the future. But I'm thinking I'm going to get that probably started in the online stuff next year.
Okay, no, that's great. Everything takes time. Like I'm very much a,
Yeah, it
I've,
does.
I'm 40 now. I've hit the point where I'm like actually slowing down has some benefits. I can't do what I did when I was in my 20s. So, but also being okay with stuff takes time, and no,
Mhm.
that's great. It does take time.
So Nancy, actually, I know Nancy. She sent me a question. I want to answer it to everyone because it was a direct message by accident, I think.
Mhm.
What was the berry you mentioned earlier that does well in cold climates? And this is a good question, Nancy, so I wanted to tell everyone this. So the berry was called the hasp berry. So I'm going to write it in the chat. This is a cool berry. If you know this berry, this is an awesome berry. It's usually the first fruiting berry for any garden or any farm. It does so well. It does really good in like the really cold winters in Russia, and that's cold. And this berry tastes kind of like a blueberry to me. Maybe it's different for you. Maybe a blueberry and a pear, but it tastes really, really good. It looks like an elongated blueberry, and it's really beautiful. You can get a haspberry shrub in its second year at most garden centers. There's this garden center named Whiffle Tree Nursery, and they have amazing shrubs. And usually you'll get fruit in the third or fourth year. And by the fifth year, you're going to get a lot of fruit. So the haspberry is really good. Another really good cold climate bush is a sea buckthorn. You might think, oh, buckthorn, I know that name. But it's amazing. It's such a good berry and it's so tasty. And you can actually use it as hedgerows. Because of its thorns, the deer don't like it. So if you live in a rural area, this is the best berry I could ever say. And it does amazing in really, really cold climates like minus 30. I can still survive. So those are my two favorite berries for cold season.
And sort of funny coincidence. I literally was doing some baking right before, like while I had dinner in the oven, I put some other stuff to bake in the oven, and I grabbed a recipe. I have frozen peaches from my Ottawa peach tree. I've given many seeds of this tree away because it grows, and I like them with Hasket berries. So literally have a peach and a Hasket cake sitting for me. It was cooling in the kitchen while this taco, and I'm having peach and Hasket cake after. This
That's
talk.
cool.
So they do really well in Ottawa too. They grow very well in the cold. Um, and actually, I think the sea buckthorn is a different species than the buckthorn that's the
Yeah, it is.
problematic one. So
Yeah.
it's they share a name, but they're not the same same thing. Wouldn't want to eat the other buckthorn berries. I'm just looking at is anybody else got questions they want to? Oh, actually, somebody was just typing a nice long one there. So yes, are you familiar with or in touch with Susan Posner, I assume that's or Orchard People. She does a really great job with online courses on fruit tree growing and puts a lot of free educational resources out there through her podcasts, her workshops, and courses. If you're interested in creating online courses, she might have some great suggestions. So there's a
Yeah,
resource.
I know of them. Yeah.
Yeah, examples of. I'm just seeing if there's other stuff. Oh, actually, I just sort of as I was jotting things down, and anybody feel free to interrupt me, by the way. Like if you've got questions or thoughts, add them in. But while you were talking, I love you mentioned about right at the start, you were making people uncomfortable, and I'm like, good job. Excellent. There's a lot of making people uncomfortable that actually needs to happen, because once you get out the other side of being uncomfortable, that's where the really good progress actually happens. That's where change happens. But
Yeah. When you're thinking about really any change in history, it all started with people being uncomfortable. That's kind of the thing, right? Every single civil rights we have, any human rights we have, always started with people being uncomfortable, changing the status quo. And a lot of people didn't want to listen to me because I was like 22 at the time. I'm 23. I was 22, and everyone just thought I was just blowing air, that I was just, complaining. But then when it turned out that this actually worked, what I was saying that needed to happen, their thoughts changed a lot. So I would say, don't be so hard on yourself. And if it doesn't look like it's going to work, give it some time. Like, give it a solid 6 months and then see what's going to happen. Because more often than not, you're probably going to get people from your community sending you emails and saying, "Hey, I love this idea." And you'll be like, "Wow, there's the people that actually want this to happen." So that's what happened for me. And no one thought growing the Margins or Sundance Harvest would work. I actually got a lot of pushback at conferences and events, but now it works, and a lot of my alumni are starting farms. I'm really happy to say that I stuck with it.
well, and also sometimes getting the pushback is a good indication that if you do that thing, it's actually going to cause change.
Mm.
And that's what people are pushing back against, is they don't want to see things take a different turn. So there's another question in the chat. Suggestions for approaching a municipality or landowners with land like churches for getting land for allotment gardens or urban farms. So do you
Yeah,
have?
I can give you some really good suggestions because I have a program that's kind of similar. It's called Liberating Lawns, and it's in the chat right here if you want to check that out. And what Liberating Lawns is, it's a yard sharing program. So here in Toronto, we don't really have one that's active. And when COVID hit, I was worried because the community gardens weren't being opened up. They were taking way too long. Like, they opened up in June or something. So everyone was like, what's going to happen? And I was like, well, why don't they just start something? So I started a yard sharing project that's completely free, and I volunteered a lot of my time to get it started, like 100 hours or something. And it matches up yard owners or like landholders with growers per neighborhood. So I broke Toronto into like 10 neighborhoods based on the wards, and each neighborhood has its own individual map. And that map is then shared to people who fill out an intake form for either a landholder or grower, and they pass like the intake. Because I have to still look at the forms. If someone wants to grow a field of petunias and someone wants to grow cabbage, I'm going to choose the cabbage usually because it's an edible project. It's about growing food. So that's something that I got started. I would say my suggestion for approaching municipalities will always be much, much harder. I actually don't work with the city. There's a great project here in Toronto. It's called Flemo Farm, and it's actually Food Share and Toronto Urban Growers. They started this project in the Hydro Corridor, and it's basically in a low-income neighborhood. A lot of the residents wanted to participate in urban agriculture, sell their food, but they didn't have a space to do it. And you actually can't sell vegetables grown in community gardens here in Toronto. It's against the bylaw if the community gardens are on public land. So that's something that you want to really think about. If you're starting a project or a community garden, you don't want to have it on municipal property if people can't sell the food, because you can't pay your rent in kale. People will still need to sell their food to make a living, to buy a Metro Pass, to pay their hydro bill. And that's something that a lot of people in food security work don't think about a lot. They didn't think about just the food piece and not the income piece. So this project that I linked in the chat, it actually allows the residents in the community to grow food on allotments, sell the food, and also have the food for themselves so they can generate income and jobs and also dignified work within the community. So that's a really beautiful project. My suggestions would be always to approach individual like landholders and like churches separately before you do the city, because Flemo Farm took well over 5 years, well over. Um, it's been a long time coming and a lot of fight to have it happen, and you might get discouraged if this is your first project. So with churches, the easiest thing to do is actually say, I would like to start a community garden, I would like to start a youth garden, and make it very community centered, because most churches and mosques and temples, they are very in favor of community and togetherness and that kind of peaceful nature. So having a project that's related to community and building up community is usually very well received. So my biggest tip is to have a proposal. So have something written out, have it like maybe a year proposal, say like what would happen each month, how many people will be visiting the site, if you need access to water, if you'll share the vegetables, they'll like that, and things like that. So having a written proposal is the best thing to do. The easiest place to start it with is honestly places of worship. They're the most receptive, I've noticed. Even now, I get emails from places of worship asking me to start gardens or start youth gardens. So they're most likely very receptive, and there won't be any really issue regarding municipal bylaws about food and stuff. And the second place I would think is with landholders. Starting something like Liberating Lawns in your neighborhood or your town is a really good idea, because you can actually sell the food on the property. A cool example in BC is actually called City Beat Farm. I don't know if you know City Beat Farm, but what they do is they have a bunch of different plots around, I think it's Vancouver, and they grow food and they sell it directly in a CSA. And I dropped the link in the chat, and that's a really good example of spin farming. So spin farming is something you can look up too, and it's basically yard sharing, but to the extreme. So it's like a person having 10 plots in the same neighborhood, and they grow food at all 10 plots, and those 10 plots equal like half an acre or something together. So I would say have a proposal if you're approaching like an organization or a place of worship, and make sure it's detailed, as much details as possible. If that doesn't work, try yard sharing, because at least you'll have a lot less red tape.
Lovely. I know with the Liberating Lawns, you've got that up and going. I remember looking. You may have changed the website since I looked at that page. It was a little while ago when I saw another of your talks. It mentioned that it was sort of restricted in the sense that don't anybody else copy the model, for which I can understand for good reason. Is there actually opportunity for, say, if somebody in another city says, I would love to copy your model and actually follow all of your processes, that they can get in touch with you and actually do that now? Or is that still sort of just...
Okay. So the issue, yeah, you're right, you saw that. At the beginning of COVID, there were a few people that wanted to take the name Liberating Lawns, and they were actually copy and pasting what I was writing. So that's the biggest thing I have an issue with. I love when people get inspired. So you can totally like email me with your idea, as long as it's not copying the name Liberating Lawns, because I thought of that, and then also copying exactly what I wrote. If they make it their own, then I'm totally happy with that, because I don't actually own the idea of yard sharing. I just own kind of like the Liberating Lawns.
Yep. No, and that completely makes sense, because it also keeps it from getting caught up in different people doing things different way, and then people going, well, this is you. No, so I completely understood. But yeah, it looked like a really neat idea, and I could see so many people with lawns going, yes, please come and do this with my lawn. And it's being something that would be quite popular in a lot of places, certainly in Ottawa, but I imagine cities all across the country. So there's a couple of more questions in the chat. One is, what drives your interest in advocacy work? Were you always interested in social justice, anti-oppression, and equity issues?
Yeah, I would say probably have always been very interested in that. I used to get in trouble in school a lot for sticking up for people, because I was always like, this isn't okay. And before I was actually a farmer, I used to be a sex worker. So I saw a lot of the injustices within sex work as well. And I decided that, well, I want to spend my life trying to make things a bit better. And when I decided that I wanted to be a farmer, it was kind of like a no-brainer. It was pretty easy for me to see what the injustices were within agriculture, because I was a kid growing up food insecure not too long ago, right? And I kind of saw the gaps in the system. I saw that I never had any representation in agriculture. I didn't even really know how to carrot grew until I was about 16, and I went to my friend's farm. So there's a lot of these issues in my life revolving around food and food access, and also being involved in agriculture. So they were always there, no matter the work I was doing or the high school I went to or the job I was doing. I always saw it there. And I really do think my role in agriculture primarily as an educator and trying to pass the knowledge on. And I think passing the knowledge on with the least barriers involved can create the most projects. And that's what I'm really jazzed about.
Great. Another question was, do you have a lot of web skills or online organizing knowledge? It seems like a lot of your projects involve online tools. Do you do that aspect yourself, or do you have someone who's tech savvy helping you with that?
Yeah, so it may look like I'm savvy, but I actually just use a lot of software that does everything for me. So my website is built with Squarespace, and I just drag and drop literally everything. But beyond that, I wouldn't say I'm very tech savvy. I think the easiest thing to do is to minimize your time on the computer if you're a farmer. So what I try to do is I just use basic Google spreadsheets. I write most of my documents down on a Google Drive, but I just use basic run-of-the-mill things. I try not to spend more than 5 hours a week on admin tasks, and that includes email. So figuring out that's really, really important, because you can end up spending 80% of your time on the computer if you're not designating that right. So Squarespace is the easiest way to start your website, in my opinion. It's not the cheapest, but it's the easiest, and just utilizing Google Drive has helped me a lot.
Yep. There's somebody I'm going to pass that on to who is starting a farm, and I know he's already following a lot of your work,
Oh, that's nice.
and but who's actually starting a small farm project here in Ottawa this year, and he's talking about all the social media stuff he's going to do, and I'm kind of going, got it. It's gonna have to watch the time commitment around there,
Yeah.
because it's going to have you're going to have to be careful with what it will take up all of your time. So no other questions at the moment in the chat. So I'm going to go back and ask one of mine. You mentioned you have employees now, and it says a lot. Your farm's only, is it 18 months old now? Year and a half?
Probably, yeah.
And you're already up and running, profitable enough to have employees. I was just curious how many employees you have,
Yeah.
because it's all growing so quickly.
So I had one employee, well, one like teetering on full time in September to February, 2019, 2020 or something like that. And then they had to leave because they wanted to go traveling and stuff like that. And then COVID hit, so it was kind of like timing. And then in COVID, I was really confused and I wanted to hire someone else, but I had a really hard time figuring that out. And a really close friend of mine was actually looking for work and they got laid off. So in the meantime, I actually hired them primarily because we were like really, really close. And also I trust them a lot with like my vehicle, and they drive my car and they like deliver my vegetables and things like that too. But I'm actually transitioning them out because they're finding more work now, and I'm going to go back to traditionally having someone on the books, probably in March. March is the month I'm going to have someone. March or April. It depends on how soon I can find someone. But it looks like one of my Growing the Margin participants wants to work for me, so maybe they will work for me.
Isn't it great when you get to train your employees up ahead of time and they know what they're in for?
Yeah, I love it. It's amazing because they directly know what the work is, so I don't have to worry about scaring them with compost or worms or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not going to be a shock, which is always the challenge with a new employee. Does anyone else have any questions? Because I could just keep quizzing you about stuff for ages, but
no, it's Michael. I don't have questions so much as comments. Cheyenne, what you're doing is just incredible. I'm speaking. I look after Gaia College, and you know, there's education in all sorts of different areas is so important. But and I just want to encourage you. I didn't know about what you were doing. I do now, and I'm intending to follow you now. So.
Thank you.
And I have to go, so but I wanted to acknowledge that you know, just I'm really impressed, you know, in terms of what you're doing, and it's quite amazing. So Anyway, everybody else have a good evening. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is really impressive. And it's actually really, really impressive when we stop and go, "Oh, you've done all this in a year and a half." Because there's people who are still sort of at stage one, 3, 4 years in, and yeah, and you seem to have managed to get to about stage 5 in a year and a half. So yeah, it's pretty darn impressive for sort of those of us watching what you're doing. And I'm also going to say that there's often a lot of pressure people face when it comes to, well, you can either be professionally successful or you can actually address the social and race and equity issues. And I think you're a really wonderful example of, no, you can do both at the same time.
Yeah.
And if anything, I suspect you'll do better if you do both at the same time, because it means you're actually looking at things holistically instead of just focusing on one area, at the same area as everyone else, and then that means you have to compete in the same way as everybody else, and rather than just thriving with what you're best at and what's really important. So I think that's a really, really awesome example you're putting forward there of going, no, we're going to actually put the social justice issues right in the middle of everything, and still, and if anything, be more successful because of that. It helps break down that perception that you have to choose between
Thank
one or
you.
the other. And I have this thing where I keep saying you should get paid more for saving the world than destroying it.
Yeah.
So I love it when people are successful whilst actually making the world a better place for everybody rather than eroding it more and more. So I love those sort of real life examples. Oh, and somebody did put another question in the chat. Do you know of other mentorship programs in other cities?
So I don't know specifically, but I highly recommend for you to reach out to me on my Instagram, because I can just put a story up that says, "Does anyone know of any mentorship programs in any cities?" And you'll get the answers. I easily will do that. So I don't know, but I probably know someone who does know.
Lovely. Yes, I've sent a few people your way. You may have actually had some Ottawa people contact you about stuff. I know at least a couple of them have said they've gotten in touch. Oh, well, there, Tristan.
Cool.
Also, yeah, okay, and my understanding of spin gardening is that a lot of the income comes from growing premium crops for high-end restaurants. If that is so, has the pandemic caused economic downturn and caused a lot of knock-on effects for farmers like you? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So spin farming can be done for restaurants or not. The example I gave in the chat is City Beet Farm, and they don't really grow for restaurants. They grow primarily to direct consumer, so for CSA. Surprisingly, the pandemic actually has increased the amount of sales I've had by about 60%. I like Sundance Harvest grosses a fair amount each week when I'm working. I'm not working right now. And direct to consumer is the safest bet. So if you're looking to start a project or just looking to get involved within the CSA movement and you want to help at someone's farm, I suggest you to suggest to them to do direct to consumer, because it's the safest way. And as we can see with the pandemic, having a restaurant sales as your primarily source of income isn't as stable. But at least we always know that people need food. So even if you're a person at home, you still need food. And having a direct consumer is the safest way, and also allows you to build deeper relationships with your community.
Yeah, I actually saw the New York Times was doing a little series on sort of some good news stories out of the pandemic, and one was about a farm, a fairly larger one actually out in Oregon that was having that they mostly sold to restaurants, and they were like the local sort of organic food supplier to a whole bunch of them, and the pandemic hit and everything closed, and they were like, we've already ordered all the stuff for the new year, like how are we even going to pay for the stuff we've already ordered? And so they started to just put out to some people going, we're going to set up a stand, we're going to sell some of our stuff, and they within like a week they were selling more than they had been, than they had lost to the loss of the contracts to all of the restaurants. And there was other farms starting to bring stuff to them to add to what they could sell, because so many people went, what's important? Food. And suddenly everybody wanted food, and they've been, if anything, busier this year. than last. So COVID actually didn't have the effect on local food that I think people thought it might. Yeah, so and just a note about keep up the good work that somebody put in there. Was there anything else, or should we wrap up? Did anyone else have any more questions for Cheyenne? No, I think we're good. Thank you very, very much. I didn't mention at the start just because it was my Zoom decided to put me in a different room than everyone else. I don't know why. And so we started a minute or two late. But Michael, who was just here, he actually is the person who runs Gaia College. And this whole series is actually being somewhat supported by Gaia College. So if you're looking for online learning opportunities, it is all about the ecological aspects of working with land and ecosystems. So check out Gaia College if you have a chance. Thank you very, very much for being here, Cheyenne. It's really great to hear about your projects. And I'm sure some people are going to you're probably going to have a few more Instagram followers by the end of this evening. And you'll probably be hearing from some of the people who are here. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And you can email me. I dropped my email in the chat if you wanted to talk further about anything specific. And thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much.